Well, first of all, it's not something we would necessarily say on our own behalf, but I must say it is very pleasing to quite often hear that being said by others, particularly others from different sports who have a similar anti-corruption responsibility as we do, and in respect of whom they often model their approaches on the approach that we take. So if it is true that we are leaders in the world of anti-corruption in sport, I think there are a number of factors. First of all, when the unit was created 15 years ago, and for the first 10 years of its existence, it was led by Lord Condon. And I think he did excellent work and created a wonderful platform for the rest of us who follow him to build upon. So I think that's one reason. I think the other reason is that we are supported by a wonderful team within the ICC. We have a tremendous media team, we have a tremendous legal team, and we get very good support from the main board itself. And added to that, we have, I think, very important partnerships with people in law enforcement, people in other sports, as I've mentioned, and people, for example, in the legitimate world of betting. So I think working together as a team, allied to the fact that we're now not just any longer an international unit, but we have anti-corruption units in the member boards of the ICC. All of this, I think, puts us in a very healthy position. Well, you know, my background is policing, and since time immemorial, the creation of formalised policing, prevention has always been much more important than detection. And I was very pleased that the recent review we had of the work of the ICC's Anti-Corruption Unit placed great emphasis on the fact that the main planks of our activity are prevention, disruption, and only then investigation and prosecution, in that order of priority. And I think that order of priority is absolutely right. So we shouldn't be judged by the number of prosecutions which have been engaged in. We should be judged by the level of prevention we're able to bring to bear. And I think that's a very positive story. Education of players, particularly young players, is absolutely crucial. You know, there was an international sports security body created in Doha a few years ago, and while they were concentrating specifically on physical security at venues for big sporting events, I from the floor raised the question of corruption and how insidious that can be. And while frankly it can often be relatively easy to ensure good security, it's just as important for any sport to make sure they deal with the threat of corruption. So in that whole area, and I spoke to a number of international athletes and tennis players at that event, and they had never experienced in their careers the whole question of corruption and the whole question of being educated and how to recognize it and what to do if it should raise its ugly head. So I think education is very important for players, particularly young players, to make them aware of the evil intent of people out there who would seek to have them drawn into their clutches and who would seek to corrupt them. Education is a very important part of prevention. Well, we do get a lot of information shared with us, and we want to increase that flow. We certainly don't want to turn information away. We don't want to put people off providing us with information. But information comes in all forms. Sometimes, quite frankly, it can be little more than tittle-tattle and gossip. Every piece of information we get goes into our database, is compared with what we already have in that database. And even if at that time it doesn't help further any investigation, who knows in the future what other pieces may be added to that particular piece of information. So I certainly want to keep encouraging people to provide us with all the information that they can. And I would want to take this opportunity to assure them that we do not ignore any piece of information. Of course, right at the other end of the spectrum, if people are to be charged, then they must be charged based only on evidence. So receiving information is one thing, but there's a very lengthy process before that information becomes intelligence, before that becomes intelligence which we can exploit, before that becomes evidence which we can place before a tribunal or indeed a court of law through our partners in law enforcement. Well, one thing I have no doubt about, that they're most evil. These are organised criminals. These are members of organised criminal gangs across the world. And that was brought home very evidently in our preparations for the World Cup, when the Australian Federal Police Because these are organised criminals, we're very willing to engage in information sharing memoranda of understanding with us, as were New Zealand police, as were the individual state police organisations throughout Australia. And we have similar MOUs about to be signed with the National Crime Agency in the UK, with investigative authorities in India and South Africa. And the fact that we work in close collaboration with those investigative authorities is evident that they indeed recognise that these corruptors are members of organised criminal gangs right across the world and must be attacked globally in that joint effort and through those joint partnerships that I've described. Will ill health ever be eradicated? Will crime ever be eradicated? And I think the frank answer has to be never totally and absolutely eradicated. But that doesn't stop us working the very hardest that we can, making the greatest effort that we can to eradicate the game as far as it's humanly possible to do. So these three players you mentioned have been dealt with, they've been punished, they've met their punishment. It's not a matter, I think, for their home board to decide whether they should ever grace an international cricket team again. And that's not just a question of ability, it's a question of their remorse, their realisation of how wrong their behaviour was, and their willingness to use that negative experience of theirs in education programs. So there are a whole range of elements in the decision-making process. So I can think one thing personally, but I mustn't ever let what I think personally prevent the professional discharge of my responsibility. And my responsibility was to bring those players to justice, and they were brought to justice. What happens to them thereafter, I think, is very much a matter for their own home board, first of all. And I know they are going through a rigorous rehabilitation program, and I will watch with interest to see the results of that program.